In 2019, a mother in Ohio learned that her son, officially cremated 6 years earlier, had never been turned to ashes at all. His body had been sold, preserved, and displayed in a traveling human anatomy exhibit without her consent. What began as a routine phone call unraveled a chain of lies involving murder, forged documents, and a funeral industry built on silence. This is the story of how a mother discovered the truth and refused to let it be buried again. Marianne Brooks had never expected a phone call to change the trajectory of her life entirely. She was at her usual post in the intensive care wing of a Cleveland hospital, monitoring patients and navigating the endless ebb and flow of emergencies, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, labeling it as yet another telemarketing ploy, another intrusion in an already exhausting day. But something about the voice on the other end immediately unsettled her, a precision and calm that didn't belong to a scammer. "Mrs. Brooks," the voice said, "we need to speak about your son." Marianne froze, her heart tightening in a way that made the bustling hallway of nurses and stretchers fade into a blur. Her son, Ethan, had been gone for 6 years. She had scattered his ashes at Lake Erie, the waves carrying fragments of him into the horizon. She had mourned, adapted, and tried to rebuild her life around the absence of his laughter, his bright smile. The small daily rituals of a young man with diabetes who had been meticulous about his health, yet tragically fragile. The caller introduced herself as a representative from a company in Phoenix, Arizona, a facility that showcased preserved human specimens for educational and exhibition purposes. She explained that during a routine inspection of one of their specimens, they had discovered something deeply personal, a medical alert bracelet engraved with Ethan's name, his date of birth, and her own phone number as the emergency contact. At first, Marianne thought she must be dreaming, the kind of nightmare that made your blood run cold, but was entirely impossible. Her mind raced through memories of cremation arrangements, the careful spreading of ashes, the small wooden urn she had brought home, the sunset over the lake, and the whispered promises that Ethan could rest without pain. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. And yet, every detail the woman described matched perfectly: the bracelet, the inscriptions, the specifications of his type 1 diabetes. Marianne's hands shook as the representative insisted she travel to Phoenix immediately to verify the specimen. Every rational instinct screamed at her to refuse, to stay grounded in the reality she had lived with for years. Ethan was dead. He had been dead, and she had said goodbye. She had felt the emptiness, the void of 6 years, and somehow managed to carry on. But beneath the rational arguments, a gnawing uncertainty took hold. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if the son she thought she had laid to rest was somewhere else, silent and preserved, waiting for her discovery? That night, Marianne lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling with her mind spinning in every direction. She replayed the moment she received the original news of Ethan's death back in 2013. A gentle, professional voice from a funeral home in Toledo had called her to relay the devastating information. Her 22-year-old son had died in the morning, brought in from home after a diabetic crisis that had turned fatal before anyone could intervene. The funeral home offered a budget cremation, insisting that Marianne not see Ethan's body because of the deterioration his illness had caused. Too grief-stricken to question their instructions, too heartbroken to demand to see him alive for one last moment, she had agreed. 3 days later, she had driven to pick up the ashes, a simple wooden urn, and had whispered her goodbyes as the waves took him from her forever, or so she believed. Now, 6 years later, a voice on the phone suggested everything she had accepted as truth was a lie. She questioned her own memory, the documents she had signed, the receipt from the cremation service. Every piece of evidence that had anchored her grief. Her body felt heavy with disbelief, but beneath it, a mother's intuition throbbed insistently. Ethan was out there somewhere. The woman on the phone, calm but insistent, assured her that law enforcement had been notified, and that they needed Marianne to come see the specimen in person. to determine whether it truly was her son or a tragic mix-up. The logistical details were handled to first-class flights, hotel accommodations, all expenses covered. The rational part of her mind hesitated. This was insane, but the maternal instinct, raw and uncompromising, overrode everything else. She found herself agreeing to fly the next day. Landing in Phoenix, Marianne felt as though the desert sun and the arid wind carried with them an otherworldly intensity. She was met by a driver who took her to a luxurious hotel, an environment starkly different from her modest life in Cleveland. The representative, younger and impeccably dressed, met her in the lobby and guided her through a series of carefully choreographed steps that led her to a sterile, dimly lit exhibition facility. The police detective assigned to the case was waiting, providing a measured calm as they walked through the exhibits, passing models of human anatomy and educational placards, until finally reaching a roped-off area. There, under a bright, clinical spotlight, stood the specimen. Muscles exposed, tissue preserved, the contours of bones visible beneath plastinated skin, and at the center of it all, a bracelet with Ethan's name. Mariana's world constricted into a single point: the realization that this was him, that the ashes she had scattered were not his. Her knees weakened, her chest tightened, and she could hardly breathe. Every identifying feature: the scar from his pacemaker surgery, the missing fingertip from a childhood accident, matched perfectly. Her son had been taken from her twice, once in life, and once in death, stolen from her knowledge and her mourning. The subsequent hours were a blur of DNA tests, interviews, and police questioning. Marianne provided every scrap of information she could remember about funeral arrangements, the cremation contract, and the supposed death certificate. While investigators pieced together a horrifying truth, the funeral director she had trusted had forged documents, sold her son's body to a corporate intermediary, and facilitated its eventual display in traveling exhibits. The depth of deception, the breadth of the operation, and the realization that her grief had been manipulated for profit left Marianne numb, shaking, and determined. The case was no longer simply about her son. It was about exposing a network of fraud, deception, and exploitation that had targeted countless grieving families. Every memory of Ethan, the trips to Lake Erie, the small arguments, his meticulous care of his health now carried a weight far beyond personal loss. They were evidence of a life taken, a lie maintained, and a system that had allowed it to happen. The journey she was about to undertake would test her resilience, her faith in justice, and the unyielding love of a mother who refused to let her child remain lost, even against the weight of legal battles, corporate obfuscation, and a public that struggled to understand the cruelty she faced. The moment Marianne agreed to the flight, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation gripped her. Every memory of Ethan came flooding back, not just the tragic final days, but the countless small moments that made up the tapestry of his life. She remembered his quiet mornings, carefully checking his insulin levels before breakfast. The way he always left a note for her on the kitchen counter when he went to class or work, telling her not to worry, that he'd be home for dinner. Those small reassurances now seemed like echoes from a life stolen from her, reminders of what had been taken and what she might finally recover. The flight itself was a blur. The desert landscape stretching beneath the plane seemed endless and unyielding, a mirror for the unknown she was heading into. She wondered how she would recognize him, how she would respond if, indeed, the impossible were true. The very idea of Ethan standing, or in this case, lying preserved in a display case somewhere in Phoenix, felt surreal, grotesque even. Her mind alternated between hope and horror, each one striking harder than the last. Arriving at the airport, she was met by a quiet, professional driver who navigated the streets of Phoenix with a practiced calm. The city was scorching in the late afternoon sun, the air shimmering over asphalt, but Marianne barely noticed. The world around her had contracted to a single purpose: to find the truth about her son. The representative from the exhibit, a sharply dressed woman named Caroline Ames, met her in the lobby of the hotel, her demeanor careful and precise. as if she were walking a tightrope between conveying facts and avoiding unnecessary alarm. Marianne noticed the sleekness of the lobby, the polished surfaces, the distant hum of air conditioning and elevators. Everything seemed too pristine, too controlled, as if this world was carefully curated to prevent the chaos of what Marianne would discover from spilling out. She followed Caroline quietly, answering none of the questions posed, only nodding when prompted. Her hands were clenched, her heart hammering, each footstep echoing in the cavernous, almost empty corridors of the exhibition facility. When they finally reached the roped-off section, Marianne's breath caught. The specimen stood under a harsh white spotlight, its form both anatomical and disturbingly human. Muscles and tendons were visible where the skin had been replaced with plastinated material, organs partially exposed. The stark red and brown tones of preserved tissue illuminated as though for a medical textbook. Marianne's eyes were immediately drawn to the bracelet on the wrist. She stepped closer, each movement hesitant, as if the air itself had thickened. There it was, Ethan Brooks, etched into metal, a lifeline from the boy she remembered. Her hands trembled, a visceral, uncontrollable reaction. She could see the scar across the chest from his pacemaker surgery, the meticulous line that had healed over 6 years ago but remained unmistakable. She observed the left hand, the ring finger truncated at the first knuckle, exactly as it had been after the shop class accident years prior. Her mind screamed in disbelief, in grief, in anger. How could this be happening? How could she have carried his ashes, watched the waves consume them, only to find him here, preserved like a specimen, stripped of his life and autonomy, displayed for strangers to gawk at? A detective, tall with calm, steady eyes, began to explain the legal and procedural steps that would follow. Marianne barely heard him. Her attention was riveted entirely on the figure before her. Not tests would confirm the identity, but there was no doubt in her mind. Every identifying detail, the bracelet, the scar, the finger, pointed to the unthinkable truth. Ethan had never been cremated. The funeral home, the documents she had trusted, the ashes she had spread, none of it had been real. The grief she had lived with for 6 years was based on a lie, an orchestrated deception that had allowed someone else to profit from her pain. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, to speak, to think clearly. It was as if the world had turned upside down, leaving her dangling in a space between disbelief and the unbearable clarity of truth. Caroline Ames gently explained the circumstances of the discovery. During a routine audit of specimens, they had noted the bracelet and traced the emergency contact to Marianne. Law enforcement had been involved from the moment the match was suspected, and every precaution was being taken to ensure Marianne's safety and the integrity of the investigation. As she listened, Marianne's mind drifted back to the early days after Ethan's supposed death. She remembered the quiet mornings in the apartment, the way she had tiptoed around his absence, trying not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of her own life. She remembered the nights lying awake, feeling the hollow absence in her chest, the rituals of grief that became second nature, lighting candles, placing flowers at the lake, speaking to the boy who was no longer there. All of it felt violated now, as though the foundation of her reality had been built on falsehoods. The betrayal was not only by the people who had taken Ethan's body, but by the very systems she had trusted to care for her family in the most vulnerable moments. As the hours passed, Marianne was escorted through the facility, shown other specimens in storage, though none bore the intimate markers of her son. She tried to memorize every detail of Ethan's form, the precise angle of his preserved stance, the way the light fell on the plastinated surfaces, the minute traces of humanity that remained visible despite the technical preservation process. It was horrifying, almost grotesque, and yet undeniably him. Caroline and the detective remained nearby, explaining that further steps would involve verification, and the beginning of an investigation into how the specimen had arrived there. Tracing the chain of custody through funeral homes, intermediaries, and possibly fraudulent documentation. Marianne's thoughts were scattered but purposeful, She needed to know who had done this, why it had happened, and how many others had suffered the same betrayal. The weight of maternal instinct, sharpened into a fierce determination, overrode any fear, any despair, any lingering disbelief. Ethan deserved justice, and she was going to pursue it, even if it meant confronting the cold machinery of law, commerce, and deceit that had stolen him from her for so long. Returning to the hotel that evening, Mary Ann struggled to eat, to sleep, to process the events she had witnessed. Every sensation was magnified, the sterile scent of the exhibit, the harshness of the spotlight, the metallic glint of the bracelet. Her thoughts returned constantly to Lake Erie, to the ashes she had scattered, to the quiet lies she had believed in good faith. But beneath the anger, beneath the grief, a new sense of purpose emerged. She was no longer simply a mother mourning a son. She was an advocate for truth, a witness to the injustices committed against countless families who had placed their trust in those responsible for the dead. Each memory of Ethan's life, his laughter, his care, his struggles with diabetes, the small victories and defeats of youth became fuel for her determination. The journey ahead was unclear, fraught with legal challenges, corporate resistance, and personal anguish, yet the path was now inescapable. She had seen her son. She had touched the fragments of his life preserved in new ways both scientific and grotesque. And she would not rest until the world acknowledged the violation, until the truth was known, until Ethan was finally given the dignity that had been stolen from him. The days after Mary Ann saw Ethan's preserved body in Phoenix were a haze of disbelief, fear, and painstaking deliberation. She returned to her hotel room each night exhausted, not just from travel, but from the mental weight of knowing that the life she had mourned for 6 years had been stolen and manipulated by people she had trusted. She spent hours sifting through every piece of paper she could find from 2013, the cremation receipt, the paperwork from the funeral home in Toledo, the copy of the death certificate that had been mailed to her. Every line, every signature, every stamp now seemed suspect. How could she have been so thoroughly deceived? How could Leonard Hale, the man she thought she trusted with her son's final moments, have orchestrated such a web of lies? And who else had profited from her grief? Mary Ann began compiling the facts, documenting her memories in painstaking detail. She wrote down everything she could recall about the cremation arrangements, every phone call with the funeral director, every interaction at the crematory. She had always been a careful person, meticulous with Ethan's medical records, his insulin schedules, his appointments. And she now applied that same discipline to reconstructing the events surrounding his supposed death. She reviewed the date of each call, the exact wording of each conversation, trying to trace where the deception could have entered. The more she examined the documents, the more glaring the inconsistencies became. Names were spelled differently, addresses didn't match legitimate cremation facilities, and dates were suspiciously precise, as if someone had wanted to create a flawless paper trail to cover up a criminal act. Her anger simmered, but beneath it, a fierce determination took root. She would not allow her son's death to be hidden or dismissed. The detective assigned to the case, a steady presence with a calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with Mary Ann's emotional turmoil, began walking her through the preliminary investigation. They traced Ethan's supposed cremation back to Leonard Hale's funeral home and discovered a series of irregularities that would soon shock her. Over the course of 6 years, Hale had claimed to have cremated dozens of bodies, each time providing families with official-looking paperwork and receipts. But according to investigators, the facilities he cited either did not exist or were unverified locations. It became clear that Mary Ann's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, systematic pattern of fraud. The realization made her stomach turn. Her personal tragedy was not only a story of loss, but part of a much broader betrayal, one that affected families across multiple states. The horror of it, the scale of the deception, the casual disregard for the grieving was almost unbearable. Mary Ann's mind kept circling back to the moment she scattered Ethan's ashes at Lake Erie. She had watched the small urn tip and the wind carry the fine particles away, believing she was giving him final peace. That act which had been so sacred, so intimate, was now a cruel illusion. She pictured the plasticized body of her son in Phoenix, exhibited under bright lights, analyzed by strangers, and her grief felt new and raw again. She could not reconcile the maternal need to protect with the grotesque reality of his exposure. And yet, every flash of memory, every scar and injury she recalled from his life, the surgery, the lost fingertip, the meticulous management of his diabetes, was reflected in the specimen before her, confirming the truth that the fraud she was uncovering had been personal, deliberate, and exploitative. Her investigation did not stop at documents and memories. Marianne met with former employees of the funeral home, workers who had grown uneasy about Hale's practices over the years. Many were hesitant, fearful of legal consequences, but some eventually spoke under the assurance of anonymity. They described bodies that were never cremated, paperwork that was routinely forged, and transactions that sent remains into private hands, often to intermediaries who claimed to provide educational or research services. Each revelation was a blow, compounding the sense of betrayal Marianne felt and intensifying her determination to see justice done. The scope of the operation was staggering: families deceived, grieving parents manipulated, the remains of loved ones treated as commodities. She could see the pattern emerge, like threads on a loom, connecting one tragic story to the next. Each thread a testament to human greed and the exploitation of grief. Marianne spent hours poring over the lists of supposed cremations, cross-referencing names and dates, attempting to locate other potential victims. The sheer number of discrepancies suggested that Ethan was not the only victim. Every name she read, every date she verified, heightened her resolve. Her personal anguish now took on a larger mission. She would not only seek justice for Ethan, but for every family who had unknowingly participated in a charade of loss. She felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of speaking for those who had no idea their loved ones had been stolen or misrepresented. Each piece of information she uncovered became ammunition for the battle she was beginning. A meticulous, emotionally taxing war waged against deceit, corporate indifference, and systemic oversight failures. Her nights were long and sleepless. Marianne often found herself staring at the ceiling of her hotel room in Phoenix, visualizing conversations with lawyers, investigators, and the representatives of the exhibition company. She replayed the detective's words in her head, analyzing every legal term, every nuance of what could be considered evidence. The idea that her son's body might be legally classified as property, held as evidence, and used as a tool in corporate defense filings was abhorrent. She wrestled with her outrage, her sorrow, and the gnawing sense of injustice. Marianne also began reaching out discreetly to other families, connecting through online support networks, social media forums, and word of mouth, seeking any fragments of similar experiences. In each story, she recognized the same pain, the same betrayal, the same disbelief that had haunted her since the first revelation. The threads of empathy and shared trauma formed a tapestry of urgency that strengthened her resolve. She would be their voice if she had to, ensuring that these hidden abuses could not remain unchallenged. In quiet moments, Marianne reflected on her son's life. She remembered the laughter that filled their small apartment, the careful management of his condition, the tiny acts of rebellion and independence that marked his journey to adulthood. These memories became her anchor, a reminder that Ethan had been a full, vibrant person, not just a name on a legal document or a figure in an exhibit. She clung to them, using them to fuel her fight against the injustice she was uncovering. Every fraudulent receipt, every forged signature, every manipulated document became a symbol of the system's failure, but also a challenge Marianne was determined to meet. The maternal instinct that had once driven her to monitor insulin levels and soothe the fevers now propelled her into the role of investigator, advocate, and eventual reformer. She refused to let her grief be co-opted or her son's life reduced to a footnote in a story of corruption and deceit. Through her growing involvement in the case, Marianne came to understand the complex network that had facilitated the theft and exhibition of Ethan's body. Leonard Hale had not acted alone as intermediaries. Exhibition companies and possibly complicit officials had created a chain of transactions designed to obscure accountability. Every connection she uncovered was another step toward reclaiming her son's dignity and exposing the systemic flaws that allowed such exploitation. She began constructing timelines, documenting inconsistencies, and preparing herself mentally and emotionally for the long battle ahead. The realization that she might have to navigate courts, corporate legal teams, and public opinion was daunting. Yet the thought of leaving Ethan's story untold or unchallenged was impossible. Her grief had transformed into purpose, sorrow into action, and mourning into advocacy. By the end of her first week in Phoenix, Marianne felt a blend of exhaustion, clarity, and a determination unlike anything she had experienced. She had confirmed the identity of the specimen, traced the initial fraudulent documentation, and begun connecting with both law enforcement and other families affected by similar acts. The enormity of the deception weighed on her, but so did the clarity of her mission. She understood that the fight for Ethan's dignity would not be quick or easy. Legal battles, corporate pushback, and public scrutiny would test her resilience. But she had already confronted the unimaginable, the discovery of her son, not in rest but preserved, manipulated, and displayed. That confrontation had transformed her, hardening her resolve and sharpening her focus. Marianne Brooks would not allow her son's life, and the lives of countless others, to be treated as disposable. She would pursue the truth, demand accountability, and reclaim what had been stolen not just for herself, but for every family betrayed in similar ways. Marianne sat in a sterile examination room, the hum of fluorescent lights above her echoing the emptiness she felt inside. Across the table, a lab technician swabbed the inside of her cheek with quiet efficiency, explaining that the sample would be compared to DNA from the preserved specimen labeled as her son. Marianne barely registered the words. Her mind was racing through every possibility, every terrifying scenario that could have led to this moment. She had seen Ethan unmistakable in his plastinated form, and yet the idea that a scientific test would have to confirm what her instincts already screamed at her felt absurd. It should have been enough that she recognized every scar, every mark, every idiosyncratic detail of his body. But in this world of bureaucracy, fraud, and legal pretense, instinct alone would not suffice. The test was necessary, the verification unavoidable, and yet the anticipation made her stomach churn with nausea and fear. Days passed slowly. Each morning, Marianne returned to the hotel with a heavy dread pressing on her chest, unsure how she would endure another moment, another revelation. When the call finally came, it was brief, clinical, and yet it shattered any remaining illusion. The DNA matched. Ethan Brooks was indeed the preserved specimen that had haunted her dreams and shattered her mornings. Confirmation, instead of offering closure, magnified the horror. It was real. The ashes she had scattered, the funeral she had attended, the rituals she had observed, all of it had been built on a lie. Her grief had been manufactured by deception, her mourning manipulated by people whose only concern had been profit. The truth settled over her like a suffocating fog, a heavy realization that her son had been stolen not just from life, but from death itself. From that point on, Marianne became a relentless force in the investigation. She met with Detective Raul Sanchez, a methodical officer with the Phoenix Police Department who had been assigned to oversee the case. And together they began tracing the chain of events that led from the funeral home in Toledo to the exhibition in Phoenix. Sanchez moved through the details with precision, examining shipping records, invoices, and contracts, while Marianne contributed every scrap of memory and document she had retained over the years. Each step forward revealed new layers of deception. The cremation certificates provided by Leonard Hale's funeral home were forgeries. Addresses on official-looking documents led to empty lots or abandoned warehouses, facilities that had never performed cremations. Payment records, suggested financial transactions had been funneled through intermediaries to cover the tracks of those orchestrating the theft of bodies. Marianne's anger was a living thing, a coiled energy that fueled her determination to see the network exposed and to ensure that her son's story would not be buried in silence. One of the first breakthroughs came from interviewing former employees of Hale's funeral home. Marianne accompanied Detective Sanchez, listening intently as workers described anomalies they had observed over the years. Bodies that were supposedly cremated were not accounted for in any official registry. Documents were routinely altered or fabricated to create an illusion of compliance. Some employees had questioned these practices at the time, but feared reprisal or legal consequences, so they had remained silent. Now, however, Marianne's presence, her insistence on truth and justice, emboldened them. Piece by piece, the scale of the operation became clear. Ethan was only one of many victims, part of a network designed to exploit grief for profit. The enormity of the realization struck Marianne with both terror and purpose. She could not stop at her own son. The others needed advocacy, exposure, a voice that would demand accountability. Marianne also began tracing financial transactions connected to the funeral home and the subsequent sale of Ethan's body. She discovered payments moving from Leonard Hale to a corporate intermediary, a company that specialized in distributing human remains for educational and exhibition purposes. The documents suggested that the intermediary, unaware of the fraudulent origins of the bodies, had purchased Ethan in good faith, believing they were acquiring legitimately donated remains for scientific study. This detail both angered and clarified the chain of events. It was clear that the intermediary company was not the ultimate villain. The fraud and criminal intent originated with Hale and, as Marianne suspected, likely involved others in his inner circle who had facilitated or covered up the theft. Every paper trail, every ledger, every email Marianne reviewed brought the picture into sharper focus, revealing a calculated system that had allowed her son to disappear from her life in the most unimaginable way. Her nights continued to be restless. She would lie awake thinking about Ethan's last days, replaying the moments before his supposed death, the visits to his doctor, the careful monitoring of his condition, and the trust she had placed in the institutions around her. Those institutions had been corrupted, exploited, and manipulated, and in doing so, they had violated not only her trust but her fundamental understanding of life and death. The realization that a human being could be taken, manipulated, and exhibited without consent haunted her. It was not only a violation of her son, but of the universal expectation that families are afforded dignity and truth in the handling of their loved ones. Marianne's grief was now intertwined with righteous anger, and she resolved that her voice would be a force against the injustice she had uncovered. Detective Sanchez worked methodically, and through a combination of subpoenaed records, cross-referenced invoices, and witness statements, the extent of Leonard Hale's operation became undeniable. Marianne's mind, sharp and focused from years of careful attention to Ethan's medical condition, became an asset in piecing together the puzzle. She noticed discrepancies in the dates, the language of the contracts, the signatures that did not match official records. She assisted in comparing handwriting, analyzing inconsistencies, and verifying financial transactions. Each detail she uncovered added weight to the case, building toward a clear narrative of fraud, theft, and exploitation. It was painstaking work, emotionally exhausting but necessary. The more she knew, the closer she came to both justice and closure, even as the reality of her son's exploitation made every revelation more painful. As the investigation progressed, Marianne began speaking with other families who had been misled by Hale. Some had assumed their loved ones had been properly cremated or donated to science. Others had received vague explanations, small gestures of apology, or reassurances that their loved ones were being treated appropriately. All of them, like Marianne, were blindsided by the revelation that the bodies were in far part of a commercial network of exploitation. These encounters reinforced Marianne's determination. She realized that Ethan's story was part of a larger system, and while personal closure was paramount, there was a responsibility to the greater community. Every family she connected with represented another thread in the tangled web, another reason to continue pushing forward, no matter how difficult the path. The weeks in Phoenix blurred into one another as Marianne attended meetings with law enforcement, legal counsel, and investigators. Each session deepened her understanding of the scope and complexity of the crimes. She learned that while some of the intermediaries had acted in good faith, Leonard Hale had systematically manipulated documentation, forged signatures, and covered up the ultimate fate of countless individuals. Every day, Marianne confronted the chilling reality that her son's body had been treated as property, sold, and exhibited for profit, while she had grieved over ashes that were never his. It was a betrayal that cut deep, sharper than the original loss, because it had taken away the finality, the ritual, and the dignity of death. Marianne had expected to mourn in peace. Instead, she was faced with a living nightmare that required courage, persistence, and an unrelenting commitment to truth. By the end of the 4th week, Marianne had established a routine with Detective Sanchez, mornings dedicated to reviewing evidence, afternoons spent conducting interviews, and evenings consumed with document analysis and outreach to other affected families. Her exhaustion was constant, her grief raw, yet her resolve never wavered. Each connection she uncovered, each document verified, brought her closer to the truth and closer to the possibility of reclaiming her son's dignity. The DNA confirmation had been the first undeniable fact. Everything else was now a matter of tracing the criminal network, identifying the perpetrators, and ensuring that justice would be served. For Marianne, this investigation was more than an attempt to understand what had happened. It was a mission to restore humanity to a world that had treated her son as an object rather than a person. Marianne's mind was restless, haunted by images of her son and the grotesque stillness of the plastinated body she had seen in Phoenix. With the DNA confirmation in hand, every detail of the investigation began to crystallize, and a chilling possibility emerged. Someone close to Ethan might have been involved. Detective Sanchez suggested they start looking into Ethan's personal relationships in Cleveland, particularly anyone who had access to him in the final days of his life. Marianne's heart sank at the thought, but she knew that uncovering the truth, no matter how painful, was the only path to justice. She began recounting Ethan's daily routines, his friends, roommates, and acquaintances, carefully cataloging anyone who might have had the opportunity or motive to harm him. Her voice, though steady, trembled with the weight of what she was revealing. The sheer possibility that someone she had trusted could have been complicit in the events leading to Ethan's death. Caleb Moore, Ethan's former roommate, quickly emerged as a person of interest. Marianne had known Caleb only casually. They had met at college orientation events and occasional social gatherings. Caleb had seemed friendly and reliable, someone Ethan trusted implicitly. But as Marianne and Detective Sanchez dug deeper, they discovered a financial connection that suggested a source of tension. Ethan had helped Caleb with tuition, loaning him a significant sum of money to cover living expenses and schooling. While Caleb had repaid part of it, there were outstanding amounts that had reportedly led to arguments between the two young men. Marianne remembered conversations with Ethan, fragments of worries he had shared about money, small frustrations he had voiced about Caleb's handling of the loan. At the time, she had dismissed them as the normal friction of young adulthood, but now they took on a sinister weight. Could a financial dispute have escalated into tragedy? The possibility twisted her stomach into knots. Investigators were able to locate Caleb in Los Angeles, where he had moved for work after college. He was cooperative when approached, polite but visibly nervous. He admitted to having known about the loan and the argument that had taken place on the evening Ethan disappeared. His recollection of the events was fragmented, tinged with guilt, but he insisted that nothing intentional had occurred, that Ethan's death had been an accident. Marianne listened to the statements, the confusion in Caleb's voice stirring a mix of anger and sorrow. The detective pressed for details, and over time, Caleb began to admit the truth of the argument had escalated physically. In a moment of panic, he had pushed Ethan, and Ethan had struck his head on a sharp corner in the apartment. The impact had been fatal. Caleb's voice cracked as he explained how he had tried to revive Ethan, how he had called Leonard Hale in desperation, unsure of what to do. He described the fear, the realization that he could go to prison, the way he had deferred to Leonard to manage the situation. It was a moment of horror and human weakness, a tragic accident compounded by choices made in panic and fear. Marianne felt her world tilt. The person she had thought of as a friend of her son had been the cause of his death, albeit unintentionally. And then there was Leonard Hale, the man who had positioned himself as a caretaker in death, but had acted in calculated deception. Hale had arrived, assessed the situation, and taken control, ostensibly to protect Caleb from legal consequences. But his methods were morally and legally reprehensible. He had orchestrated the removal of Ethan's body from the apartment, transferred it to the funeral home, and provided Marianne with falsified documentation, claiming cremation had been completed. The ashes she had so carefully scattered at Lake Erie were not her son's. The weight of that betrayal pressed on her like a physical force, the realization that she had mourned over a lie, that her grief had been manipulated and commodified. Every detail of Hale's cover-up revealed a meticulous planning designed to conceal the truth while maintaining appearances. He had forged paperwork, arranged transactions with intermediaries, and ensured that no trace of Ethan's true fate would reach Marianne. The body was sold under the guise of a legitimate donation, eventually ending up in the Phoenix exhibition. Every choice Hale had made was calculated to protect himself and the network he had established. And every deception compounded the emotional devastation Marianne experienced. The idea that her son had been treated as a commodity, a spectacle, for years while she lived under the assumption that he was gone, was almost unbearable. Her mind oscillated between rage and despair, each feeling intensifying the other, each memory of Ethan more painful in light of the truth. Marianne began to understand the complexity of the web she was untangling. Caleb's actions, while accidental, had been the catalyst for Hale's fraudulent activities. Without the initial misstep, the chain of deceit might never have existed. The realization that tragedy and criminal intent had intertwined so tightly made the investigation both more urgent and more personal. Every step she took, every conversation she had with law enforcement, felt like she was piecing together a puzzle whose pieces had been deliberately hidden. The sense of moral outrage was coupled with a stark recognition that the system allowed such manipulations to occur with shocking ease. Hale's ability to exploit both human error and institutional oversight highlighted vulnerabilities that Marianne felt compelled to expose. Not just for Ethan, but for every family who might have been deceived similarly. Throughout this process, Marianne kept detailed notes, recording conversations with Caleb, with investigators, and with employees of the funeral home who had witnessed irregularities. Each statement, each piece of evidence, created a mosaic of truth that was both horrifying and necessary. She realized that understanding the full story required both confronting human fallibility and holding those who had acted with malice accountable. Caleb's confessions painted a picture of fear and panic, of choices made in desperation. And yet it was Leonard Hale's calculated decisions that transformed an accident into a long-term deception. Marianne's focus was not only on understanding what happened to Ethan, but also on ensuring that the broader network of wrongdoing was exposed and addressed. The emotional toll on Marianne was immense. Each interview, each revelation, forced her to relive the moment of loss repeatedly. Yet, in the midst of the grief and anger, a sense of purpose began to solidify. She was no longer simply mourning. She was advocating, investigating, and building a case that would seek justice, not only for her son, but for the countless others whose trust had been violated. The tragedy of Ethan's death had been compounded by exploitation, But Marianne's resilience became the counterforce to the injustice. Her determination to uncover the truth, to follow the evidence, and to confront both accidental and deliberate wrongdoing transformed her grief into a mission that demanded accountability at every level. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the contours of the crime had become undeniable. Caleb Moore had inadvertently caused Ethan's death, his panic leading him to call Leonard Hale, who then orchestrated the systematic removal, falsification, and eventual sale of the body. The human and moral consequences of these actions were staggering, revealing a profound exploitation of grief, trust, and innocence. For Marianne, the work ahead was clear. She needed to ensure that Caleb's confession, Hale's fraudulent activities, and the broader network of intermediaries were brought into the light. The personal pain she endured, the knowledge of how her son had been treated, fueled her resolve. Every detail mattered, every witness accounted for, every document scrutinized. Because in the culmination of these efforts lay not only justice for Ethan, but a path to prevent others from experiencing the same violations of trust, grief, and human dignity. After uncovering the role Caleb Moore had played in Ethan's death and learning the details of Leonard Hale's cover-up, Marianne's focus shifted to a broader, more daunting task, understanding the full scope of the network Hale had built over years. Working closely with Detective Sanchez, she began tracing financial records, contracts, and correspondence that connected the funeral home to a chain of intermediaries and exhibition companies across multiple states. Each document, each invoice, revealed the magnitude of the operation. Families had been deceived systematically, their grief exploited for profit, and the realization made Marianne's resolve sharpen to an almost painful edge. The network was sophisticated, designed to hide the source of bodies, obscure transactions, and fabricate a veneer of legality that could withstand casual scrutiny. Every link Marianne uncovered added weight to the enormity of the betrayal, turning personal tragedy into a case of systemic abuse. As investigators began contacting families who had interacted with Hale's funeral home over the past decade, patterns emerged. Several parents recounted being told their children had been cremated or donated to science, only to find years later that their loved ones had never been properly handled. Some of the bodies had been sold to companies that performed plastination or prepared specimens for traveling exhibits, while others ended up in research laboratories or educational institutions under fraudulent pretenses. Each revelation was another layer of horror for Marianne, illustrating how her son's case was not isolated but part of a calculated, ongoing exploitation. The sense of injustice became a fire that burned through her grief, transforming her sorrow into a meticulous, methodical pursuit of accountability. Legal discovery opened further doors. Hale's financial records revealed payments and transfers that traced bodies from the funeral home to a series of shell companies, intermediaries that claimed to distribute donated remains for medical research and educational purposes. By following the money, Marianne and the investigators could see the chain of custody, from the apartment where Ethan died to the plastination laboratory in Phoenix, then on to exhibition halls around the country. Each step highlighted the deliberate concealment of information and the extent to which the network exploited gaps in oversight and regulation. Hale had created a system that depended on secrecy, fear, and deception, manipulating both the living and the dead for personal gain. Marianne could scarcely believe the audacity, the cold calculation, and the sheer scale of what had been perpetrated. It was a crime that defied understanding, and yet every detail was provable with documents, witness statements, and the forensic confirmations of Ethan's identity. Marianne began collaborating with legal advisors to assess potential avenues for accountability. The complexity of the case, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving both accidental death and deliberate fraud, made the path ahead daunting. She realized that securing justice would require not only the cooperation of law enforcement, but also strategic legal action to address both criminal and civil liabilities. The fraud perpetrated by Hale involved forged documents, falsified cremation certificates, and the illegal sale of human remains, actions that were technically criminal, yet navigated through loopholes and gray areas in state regulations. Understanding the legal landscape became a full-time endeavor for Marianis. She meticulously reviewed statutes, precedents, and filings to ensure that every step she advocated for would contribute to both exposing the network and ultimately reclaiming her son's dignity. Interviews with former employees, intermediaries, and associates of Hale revealed additional disturbing details. Many had participated unwittingly, believing they were acting within the bounds of legitimate business, while others had turned a blind eye, complicit in maintaining the illusion of legality. Marianne listened carefully, recording statements, documenting inconsistencies, and piecing together a timeline that highlighted both accidental and intentional wrongdoing. She realized that the public perception of funeral services as trustworthy and sacrosanct had been exploited systematically, and that the lack of oversight allowed Hale to operate with impunity. Her awareness of these systemic weaknesses strengthened her resolve, instilling a sense of mission that went beyond her personal loss to encompass all families who might be affected by similar abuses. The psychological weight of the investigation was immense. Marianne grappled with the horror of what had happened to her son while simultaneously confronting the structural failures that allowed it to occur. She spent long nights reviewing contracts, comparing signatures, and analyzing discrepancies, trying to construct a clear, irrefutable narrative. The process was painstaking, emotionally draining, and often overwhelming. Yet each detail she confirmed, each inconsistency she exposed, became a tool for accountability. Marianne's grief fueled her tenacity, transforming sorrow into a disciplined drive to ensure that her son's story and the broader network of exploitation would not remain hidden. Through this process, Marianne began to understand the scale of the corruption not just in Hale's funeral home, but in the broader industry. Other funeral directors, funeral homes, and intermediaries were implicated in similar practices, though perhaps not as systematically or as brazenly as Hale. The network exploited regulatory gaps, lack of tracking, and the vulnerability of grieving families, creating an underground economy where human remains could be bought and sold with little oversight. Marianne's investigation illuminated the fragility of a system that should have been rooted in transparency, trust, and accountability. She recognized that her fight was no longer just about reclaiming her son. It was about exposing an industry-wide problem that left countless families at risk of similar betrayals. Marianne's engagement with the investigation also involved extensive interaction with the Plastination Lab and Exhibition Company in Phoenix. She had to navigate corporate statements, assurances, and careful explanations while maintaining focus on the broader legal implications. The companies claimed they had acted in good faith, acquiring bodies through supposed donation programs. But Marianne and Detective Sanchez were able to trace each transaction back to Hale's fraudulent operations. The distinction between ignorance and complicity became central to the unfolding legal strategy. While the lab and exhibition company might not have been intentionally malicious, their role in perpetuating the exploitation of Ethan's body and others could not be ignored. Marianne recognized the necessity of documenting every detail, establishing a clear chain of responsibility, and preparing for potential legal battles that would likely involve corporate defenses, complex procedural arguments, and intense scrutiny. By the end of the early phase of the broader investigation, Marianne had achieved significant milestones. She had confirmed the chain of custody for Ethan's body, established the fraudulent nature of the funeral home's documents, and identified a network of intermediaries and companies implicated in the sale and exhibition of human remains. She had also begun connecting with other families who might have been affected, offering support, and documenting their experiences. Each step reinforced her determination. Her fight was now both personal and systemic, rooted in the memory of her son and the broader imperative to prevent such abuses in the future. The enormity of the task was clear, but Marianne's resolve had hardened. Grief had transformed into purpose, sorrow into disciplined action, and the loss of Ethan into a catalyst for exposure and reform. As Marianne delved deeper into the investigation, it became painfully clear that Ethan's case was not an isolated incident. Each document she examined, each testimony she collected, hinted at a broader pattern of exploitation that extended far beyond her personal tragedy. Families across multiple states had been misled into believing that their loved ones had been cremated or donated for legitimate research, only to discover later that their remains had been sold into private networks, displayed in exhibitions, or sent to laboratories with no proper oversight. Marianne was struck not only by the scale of the operation, but by the cold efficiency with which it had been executed. The same meticulous attention to paperwork and process that had given her a false sense of closure was now being revealed as part of a deliberate system designed to deceive and profit from grief. Marianne began connecting with other families who had experienced similar deceptions, reaching out through social media, online support groups, and referrals from investigators. Many had no idea where their loved ones had ended up, only that the bodies had supposedly been handled respectfully and returned or cremated. When confronted with the evidence, parents and siblings were stunned, their grief compounded by shock and outrage. Marianne found herself listening to stories that mirrored her own heartbreak in haunting detail. Parents who had scattered ashes that were never real, children who had been removed without consent, and bodies that had been treated like commodities rather than human beings. Each conversation reinforced Marianne's sense of purpose, transforming her individual loss into a mission to expose systemic wrongdoing and to help families reclaim dignity for their deceased loved ones. The emotional toll was immense. Marianne spent hours each day on the phone, listening to grieving parents, guiding them through what had happened, and explaining the legal and investigative steps they would need to take. She realized that while law enforcement could pursue criminal charges, families often lacked the resources, knowledge, or emotional strength to navigate the complex legal and procedural landscape. Her own experience, the pain and the lessons learned through confronting Hale's network, made her uniquely positioned to support them. She became a bridge between the families and the investigators, helping them understand documentation, trace chains of custody, and prepare for the emotional impact of discovering that a loved one had been mishandled. Investigators continued to uncover evidence that revealed the sheer scope of Leonard Hale's operations. Hale had cultivated relationships with intermediaries and companies that dealt in human remains, including plastination labs and traveling exhibitions, as well as educational and research institutions that believed they were receiving legitimately donated bodies. Every transaction left a paper trail, meticulously forged to appear legitimate, from fake consent forms to falsified cremation certificates. Marianne pored over these documents with the same intensity she had devoted to her own records, identifying inconsistencies, matching dates, and verifying signatures. The picture that emerged was one of deliberate deception on an industrial scale. Hale had exploited the trust of grieving families, manipulated legal loopholes, and created a network that treated human bodies as mere commodities. The realization was almost unbearable, yet it strengthened Marianne's resolve to see justice done. As the network's full extent became apparent, Marianne began to organize the families she had contacted, creating informal support systems to help them cope with the shock of discovering the truth. She facilitated calls, meetings, and email chains where families could share experiences, compare documentation, and offer each other emotional support. In these exchanges, Marianne saw not only grief but a growing sense of empowerment. By connecting, sharing knowledge, and supporting one another, these families could confront the network of exploitation more effectively than any individual acting alone. Marianne's leadership became a source of strength as she guided them through the labyrinth of evidence, legal obligations, and emotional recovery, always keeping the focus on reclaiming dignity for their loved ones. The investigative team also began to uncover other unexpected details. Some bodies had been held for years, plastinated and displayed in multiple states, raising questions about the lack of oversight and accountability within the exhibition industry itself. Marianne learned that while some intermediaries acted in good faith, believing they were facilitating educational opportunities, others were complicit in perpetuating the deception, turning a blind eye to irregularities for financial gain. The boundaries between accidental oversight and intentional wrongdoing were often blurred, but the victims' families like hers experienced the same profound violation. Marianne understood that exposing the network required both meticulous documentation and a clear narrative that could withstand scrutiny in court and in the court of public opinion. Every name she traced, every family she connected, became another piece of the puzzle, bringing clarity to the scale and scope of the exploitation. Through these efforts, Marianne also recognized the importance of emotional resilience. Families she worked with were often in shock, struggling to process the idea that their loved ones had been misrepresented, sold, or exhibited without consent. Marianne herself felt the weight of these stories acutely, reliving the horror she had experienced with Ethan while simultaneously guiding others through their grief. Each conversation was both draining and vital, a reminder of the human cost behind the paperwork and legal filings. She developed a routine, balancing her own emotional needs with the demands of helping others, understanding that the fight for justice would be as much about providing support and validation as it would be about legal or financial restitution. As more families came forward, the emerging pattern painted a picture of systemic failure and exploitation that extended far beyond Lauderdale Hale. The fraudulent network relied on regulatory gaps, inconsistent oversight, and the vulnerability of grieving families who were often too overwhelmed to question the processes presented to them. Marianne began documenting these systemic flaws, compiling evidence that could be used not only in criminal investigations, but also to advocate for policy reform. Her personal tragedy had become the catalyst for a larger movement, one that sought to ensure that no family would endure the same betrayal she had experienced. The scale of the effort was daunting, but Marianne's focus never wavered. She understood that every piece of evidence she helped uncover, every family she guided, was a step toward both justice and prevention. In the midst of the legal and investigative work, Marianne also focused on maintaining connections with the exhibition company and the laboratories where the bodies had ended up. She monitored their compliance with investigators' requests, ensured that specimens were documented and preserved, and confirmed that families were kept informed. While the companies often maintained a posture of bureaucratic neutrality, Marianne's vigilance ensured that their actions could be tracked and, if necessary, challenged. Each interaction became a reminder that accountability required persistence, attention to detail, and the willingness to confront institutional inertia and obfuscation. Marianne's advocacy was no longer limited to her personal experience. It had become a broader effort to protect the dignity of all individuals who had been misrepresented, stolen, or exploited by the network. By the time Marianne had spent several months coordinating with families, investigators, and legal advisors, a clearer picture of the scale of Hale's fraudulent activities had emerged. Dozens of bodies, including Ethan's, had been mishandled or sold without consent. Families who had believed they were receiving final closure were now confronting a reality of theft, deception, and commodification. Marianne had helped establish a support network that allowed these families to share information, validate each other's experiences, and collectively pursue legal and investigative action. Her efforts were not only about exposing past wrongdoing but about creating safeguards for the future, ensuring that grieving families could have transparency, accountability, and the right to know the truth about the final disposition of their loved ones. Through this process, Marianne began to see the transformation in herself and in the families she supported. Grief and outrage were being channeled into action, and collective advocacy became a source of strength. Each story shared, each document uncovered, reinforced the need for reform and the importance of vigilance. Marianne's role had evolved from a grieving mother seeking answers into a leader, a strategist, and an advocate for systemic change. The fight for justice, though still long and arduous, had become a movement that extended beyond her personal loss, one that sought to restore dignity and accountability across an entire industry. The first time Marianne came face to face with Leonard Hale, she felt a cold, sharp edge of disbelief cut through her chest. He sat across from her in a sterile conference room at the Phoenix police precinct, an air of calculated calm around him, as if he had rehearsed every possible interaction 1,000 times. The man she had once trusted to care for Ethan's body was now a central figure in the criminal network she had been unraveling. His presence alone brought back the memory of the empty urn she had scattered into Lake Erie. The ritual that had been nothing more than a fabricated charade. Hale's gaze was measured, almost bored, as if the weight of the truth he had concealed for years was irrelevant to him. Marianne, however, felt the years of deception like a physical force pressing on her. A gravity that pulled at the hollow space where grief and anger collided. The detectives presented the chain of evidence, each document, invoice, and email connecting Hale to fraudulent cremation certificates, forged consent forms, and the illegal sale of human remains. Marianne listened as investigators outlined the scale of his operations, the network of intermediaries, exhibition companies, and laboratories that had participated in the exploitation of dozens of bodies. Each revelation compounded her sense of violation. Ethan's body had been stolen, displayed, and commodified, and yet the man responsible for orchestrating it all remained composed, detached, almost clinical in his demeanor. Marianne struggled to reconcile the casual arrogance of the man before her with the profound personal pain he had caused. It was surreal to consider that the same individual who had manipulated her grief had created a system so carefully designed to exploit the trust of grieving families. Marianne's emotions were volatile, cycling between rage, sorrow, and a determined need for justice. Her days became consumed by legal consultations, reviewing evidence with her attorneys, and preparing for what would inevitably be a long and complex trial. The criminal proceedings were labyrinthine, involving not only the direct evidence against Hale, but also the intricate web of transactions, corporate entities, and fraudulent documentation that had allowed him to operate for years. Each hearing was a test of endurance, forcing Marianne to revisit the intimate details of her son's death and the subsequent exploitation of his remains. The courtroom became a space where personal grief and procedural rigor collided, and Marianne had to navigate both with precision, guided by the knowledge that every statement, every piece of evidence, and every strategic decision could influence the outcome. The prosecution built its case meticulously, relying on the documentation Marianne and Detective Sanchez had compiled, witness testimony from former employees and intermediaries, and Caleb Moore's account of the accidental death. Hale's defense attempted to minimize his responsibility, framing the intermediaries as independent actors and Caleb's actions as unforeseeable. Marianne found the legal maneuvers infuriating. The attempts to shift blame onto systems rather than individuals who had deliberately exploited her family's trust. Each motion filed, each objection raised, forced her to confront not just the emotional weight of Ethan's absence, but also the structural power imbalances embedded in the legal and corporate frameworks that had allowed the exploitation to occur. The fight for justice was as much about navigating these systems as it was about holding Hale accountable. During pre-trial hearings, Marianne found herself repeatedly revisiting the photographs and descriptions of the plastinated body, mentally reconstructing every identifying mark: the bracelet, the pacemaker scar, the missing fingertip. These tangible connections to Ethan's identity became both a source of anguish and a tool for advocacy. She realized that by asserting the humanity of her son, by emphasizing that he had been a living, breathing person rather than a commodity, she could influence the moral weight of the case. Her attorneys encouraged her to focus on clear, factual testimony. Yet Marianne understood that the emotional dimension, the story of a mother deceived, A child's body stolen was essential to conveying the severity of Hale's crimes. She had to maintain composure, but within her, a storm of grief and righteous anger fueled her determination to ensure that every detail of Ethan's life and death was honored in the court proceedings. Media attention began to mount as the trial approached, with news outlets reporting on the bizarre and horrifying aspects of the case. Marianne became the public face of a story that had captured national attention, a mother discovering that her son, thought cremated, had been sold and displayed in exhibitions across the country. She received both support and criticism, with some praising her tenacity and others questioning her motives, suggesting she might be pursuing publicity or financial gain. Marianne felt the sting of these judgments acutely, yet she refused to be deterred. Her advocacy had never been about herself. It was about truth, justice, and restoring dignity to her son and the families affected by Hal's network. The media's scrutiny added pressure, but it also provided a platform to highlight the systemic failures that allowed such exploitation to occur, reinforcing Marianne's commitment to broader reform, even as she navigated the immediate legal battle. As the trial began, Marianne had to confront Hale in a more formal setting. She sat in the courtroom surrounded by lawyers, law enforcement officials, and media personnel, feeling the weight of anticipation and fear. Hale maintained his composed, almost indifferent demeanor, a stark contrast to the raw emotion that Marianne carried. Witnesses testified about the fraudulent practices, the forged documents, and the sale of human remains, while Caleb Moore provided a detailed account of the accidental death and the subsequent cover-up orchestrated by Hale. Marianne listened carefully, absorbing every detail, sometimes struggling to maintain her composure as the horrific reality unfolded. The interplay of accident, deception, and systemic exploitation was laid bare, painting a complex picture of responsibility that Marianne had to navigate emotionally while remaining focused on the pursuit of justice. The legal team presented evidence meticulously, tracing the chain of custody from the apartment where Ethan had died to the exhibition in Phoenix. Emails, invoices, and transaction records demonstrated how Hale had manipulated documents, created the illusion of legitimate cremation, and transferred bodies to intermediaries who were either unaware or complicit. Marianne found herself both horrified and vindicated. The documentation she had helped compile was now central to establishing the truth. She realized that her own painstaking work, the careful preservation of records and memories, had become an essential component of the prosecution's case. Her grief, channeled into diligence and advocacy, had created a pathway for justice to be served, transforming personal tragedy into a larger narrative of accountability. Throughout the proceedings, Marianne grappled with conflicting emotions. The desire for vengeance, the need for closure, and the moral imperative to protect other families all collided within her. She often found herself exhausted by the intensity of the process, yet each revelation, each confirmation of Hale's deceit, reinforced the necessity of her involvement. She became attuned to the subtleties of legal strategy, understanding how evidence needed to be presented and corroborated, how witness testimony could be used to establish patterns of fraud, and how the broader societal implications of the case could influence judicial decisions. Her role had evolved beyond that of a grieving mother. She had become an active participant in dismantling a network of exploitation, a vigilant advocate ensuring that the humanity of her son and others like him was recognized. As the trial progressed, Marianne also recognized the importance of self-preservation. The emotional toll of revisiting the circumstances of Ethan's death and the subsequent manipulation of his remains was immense. She relied on a support system of close friends, family, and counselors to navigate the psychological strain. Even as she testified, attended hearings, and reviewed evidence, she was acutely aware of the need to maintain her emotional equilibrium. This balance became essential not only for her own well-being but for the clarity and effectiveness of her advocacy. Marianne understood that the pursuit of justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and that her resilience, cultivated through grief and determination, would be a crucial asset in confronting Hale and ensuring accountability for the full scope of his crimes. The courtroom was packed the day the proceedings began in earnest, a tension hanging in the air that Marianne could feel pressing against her chest. Reporters jostled for position, cameras clicked, and the hum of whispered conversations created a backdrop to what felt like a surreal performance of grief, justice, and public scrutiny. Marianne sat quietly, her hands clasped together on her lap, as she watched Leonard Hale take his seat across the room. The man who had stolen her son's final dignity maintained a calm composure, as though the horror he had inflicted were irrelevant, as though the years of deceit were merely inconvenient details in a life that had somehow remained intact. Marianne's mind raced, alternating between the stark reality of what had happened to Ethan and the legal strategies she knew would be necessary to bring Hale to account. Every breath felt heavy, laden with the weight of 6 years of grief compounded by betrayal. The opening statement set the tone for what would become an arduous battle of evidence, testimony, and moral clarity. The prosecution laid out a meticulous timeline, tracing the sequence from the accident in Cleveland that led to Ethan's death to the deliberate cover-up orchestrated by Hale, and finally to the illegal transfer of his body into a commercial exhibition network. Marianne listened as the details unfolded, the cold facts juxtaposed with her memory of Ethan's laughter, his careful attention to his insulin levels, the warmth of his presence in their home. It was one thing to know intellectually that her son's body had been stolen, and another entirely to hear it laid bare in a formal setting, documented, and present to a jury that might not yet understand the depth of the violation. Each piece of evidence, the forged cremation certificate, the fabricated consent forms, the invoices for the sale of human remains, was a hammer striking against the illusion of normalcy that Hale had so carefully constructed. Witnesses began to testify, former employees of the funeral home, intermediaries who had unknowingly facilitated the sale of bodies, and Caleb Moore, who recounted the accidental circumstances of Ethan's death and his subsequent panic. Marianne sat through each testimony, at times holding back tears, at times gripping the edge of the bench as memories of her son's final days resurfaced in excruciating detail. The courtroom was a crucible of emotion, legal strategy, and ethical reckoning. Hale's defense tried to shift blame, suggesting that intermediaries acted independently, that Caleb's actions were unforeseeable, and that any wrongdoing had been unintentional. Marianne felt a surge of frustration. The argument was absurd in its audacity, yet necessary for her legal team to dismantle with precision. She knew that her role, both as a witness and as an advocate for other families, would require unwavering focus, even as her grief threatened to overwhelm her at any moment. Outside the courtroom, the story began to attract national attention. News outlets highlighted the bizarre and horrifying details. A mother discovering her son, thought cremated years ago, had been sold and displayed in exhibitions across the country. Families from multiple states came forward, some sharing their own stories of deception and exploitation, creating a public outcry that added pressure to the proceedings. Marianne became a reluctant public figure, thrust into the spotlight as both a grieving mother and a symbol of resilience. She received an outpouring of support from strangers who were horrified by the injustice, alongside critical commentary questioning her motives or the financial implications of the lawsuit. The scrutiny was exhausting, yet it also provided leverage, bringing greater transparency to a system that had allowed Hale's operation to persist unchecked for so long. As the trial progressed, Marianne and her legal team encountered resistance from corporate entities involved in the sale and display of bodies. Exhibitions, laboratories, and intermediaries often claimed they had acted in good faith, relying on documentation that appeared legitimate and failing to recognize the fraudulent practices of the funeral home. Negotiating access to records, clarifying chain of custody details, and compelling testimony required months of effort. Marianne's meticulous attention to detail became essential. She combed through invoices, shipping logs, and communications, identifying discrepancies and patterns that tied the transactions back to Hale's deliberate actions. The challenge was not just proving individual wrongdoing, but demonstrating the systemic nature of the fraud. A network that had treated grieving families as consumers rather than stakeholders in the final care of their loved ones. Each court session brought Marianne face to face with her own pain, forcing her to relive the loss of Ethan repeatedly. She wrestled with intense emotions, grief, rage, and a persistent need to ensure that her son's story was told fully and truthfully. Yet the courtroom also offered moments of clarity, when the meticulous documentation she had helped compile was acknowledged, when witnesses corroborated her account, and when the magnitude of Hale's deception became undeniable. These moments reinforced her resolve, reminding her why the fight for justice mattered not only for Ethan but for every family whose grief had been exploited. Marianne's advocacy became a balancing act, channeling her sorrow into determination, converting anger into strategic action, and maintaining composure even in the face of grotesque revelations. The public nature of the trial amplified both the stakes and the scrutiny. Journalists attended each session, reporting on testimony and evidence with varying degrees of accuracy. Marianne had to navigate the media landscape carefully, ensuring that the narrative remained truthful, respectful, and focused on the systemic issues that allowed such exploitation. She also faced the personal challenge of being constantly reminded of her son's absence, the body that had been displayed as an object of curiosity, and the years of manipulated mourning she had endured. Yet she persevered, drawing strength from the knowledge that the exposure of Hale's network could prevent similar tragedies and bring closure to other families. Every public statement, every interview became part of a larger effort to highlight the need for accountability, regulation, and transparency in the handling of human remains. Legal maneuvers continued behind the scenes, as Hale's defense attempted to suppress certain evidence and complicate the proceedings with procedural challenges. Marianne and her attorneys worked tirelessly to counter these efforts, preparing detailed responses, corroborating documentation, and coordinating with investigators to ensure that the truth could not be obscured. Each obstacle reinforced the complexity of the legal landscape and the necessity of persistent advocacy. Marianne's role had evolved into that of a central organizer, ensuring that every piece of evidence was accounted for, every witness prepared, and every aspect of the case presented with clarity and precision. Her personal investment in the case added urgency and intensity, but also a moral clarity that guided her through the labyrinth of legal strategy. As the trial neared key testimony phases, Marianne focused on the critical task of reclaiming Ethan's remains. The body, classified as evidence and temporarily held by the exhibition company, became a point of negotiation, with legal arguments required to ensure its release to his family. The emotional stakes were immense. Marianne knew that regaining possession of Ethan's body was a step toward closure. Yet she also understood that the fight for justice was inseparable from this personal goal. Every procedural step, every motion filed, and every interaction with corporate entities became intertwined with her personal mission, underscoring the delicate balance between legal strategy, emotional resilience, and moral advocacy. The day Marianne finally held Ethan's body in her hands was a moment suspended in time, heavy with a mixture of sorrow, relief, and a bitter sense of justice delayed. She had spent months navigating courtrooms, negotiating with attorneys, and ensuring that every piece of evidence she had gathered was meticulously documented, all for this single outcome, to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The funeral director responsible for the exhibition, under court order, handed over the body with formal acknowledgement. Yet Marianne barely registered the procedure itself. Her attention was wholly on the form of her son, the tangible evidence that he was no longer an abstract victim of a bureaucratic and corporate deception, but finally, physically, in her presence. Every scar, every mark, every detail she remembered from the boy he had been years ago confirmed that this was indeed Ethan, the child she had lost and mourned for half a decade. She traced the lines of his wrist, where the medical bracelet had once lived, touched the slight indentation of the scar over his chest, and for the first time, allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of her relief and heartbreak. Transporting Ethan back to Cleveland was both a logistical and an emotional ordeal. Marianne had to navigate the sensitivities of the corporate entities involved, the legal obligations of the court, and the delicate handling of her son's remains. Yet each step of the journey reinforced the profound importance of what she was doing. She was not merely reclaiming a body. She was restoring dignity to a person who had been commodified, treated as an object by those who sought profit in the suffering of families. Even in the meticulous care required for transportation, Marianne felt a deep sense of guardianship, as though she were physically undoing the years of violation imposed upon her son. The airport, the flight, and the ride from Cleveland's airport to her home all became stages in an emotional journey that was at once deeply personal and symbolically resonant, a mother taking back what the world had tried to take from her. Upon arriving home, Marianne arranged for a temporary resting place, a quiet space in which she could begin to grieve, honor, and care for Ethan in the manner he deserved. The ritual of laying out his body, observing him with the attention and tenderness of a parent, brought waves of grief that were both painful and necessary. Tears flowed freely, unrestrained by public scrutiny or legal procedure. In those moments, Marianne allowed herself to confront the enormity of what had been lost, the years of imagined mourning, the ashes that were never real, and the stolen rituals that she had believed offered closure. She whispered apologies and reassurances, speaking to Ethan as though he could hear her, a dialogue that was both symbolic and profoundly real. It was an intimate confrontation with grief and the unnaturalness of the journey that had brought them to this moment. As Marianne prepared for a proper funeral, she reflected on the experiences of the other families she had come to know throughout the investigation. Their collective grief, outrage, and eventual empowerment had created a network of support that extended far beyond her personal loss. Marianne saw her own reclamation of Ethan as part of a broader mission to restore humanity to those affected by Hale's operations. Each conversation with another grieving family reinforced the need for systemic change, the importance of transparency in funeral and donation practices, and the moral imperative to prevent similar abuses. She understood that her actions, while intensely personal, had broader societal implications. By reclaiming Ethan's body, she was also reclaiming the narrative of loss, grief, and justice for countless others whose stories had been silenced or distorted. The funeral itself was an exercise in both sorrow and empowerment. Marianne invited family, close friends, and supporters from the advocacy network she had helped build, creating a space where grief could be expressed honestly and collectively. She ensured that the rituals reflected Ethan's life, his personality, and the love that defined his relationships. The service was intimate yet resonant, a stark counterpoint to the impersonal and exploitive handling of his remains by the network Hale had constructed. Every gesture, every prayer, and every word spoken was a reclamation of dignity, a statement that Ethan's life and death mattered beyond the manipulation of corporate greed. Marianne felt the weight of the years lift slightly, replaced by the tangible affirmation that she had fought for her son in both life and death, and that her grief had been acknowledged, honored, and validated. In the days following the funeral, Marianne turned her attention more deliberately to advocacy and systemic reform. She recognized that while Ethan's body had been returned, the larger issues that allowed the exploitation of grieving families persisted. She began working with legislators, industry regulators, and advocacy organizations to strengthen oversight of funeral homes, intermediaries, and companies handling donated human remains. Her personal experience provided both credibility and moral urgency to these efforts. Marianne understood that reform required more than legislation. It required cultural awareness, ethical accountability, and vigilance on the part of families and institutions alike. Each meeting, each proposal, and each discussion was informed by the intimate knowledge of what betrayal and exploitation could look like when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. Mariana's efforts also focused on education and support for other families. She helped establish channels for information sharing, legal guidance, and emotional support, ensuring that families could respond proactively when confronted with similar situations. Her story became a touchstone, a cautionary tale illustrating the intersection of personal tragedy and systemic failure. She wrote articles, gave interviews, and participated in panels that highlighted both the human and regulatory dimensions of the crisis. In doing so, she transformed her grief into action, ensuring that the painful lessons learned from Ethan's case would inform policies, practices, and awareness for years to come. Her advocacy became a living memorial to her son, a way of channeling personal loss into societal benefit. Throughout this period, Marianne continued to wrestle with the emotional complexity of reclaiming Ethan. Even in victory, the pain of years spent mourning a body that was not his, the betrayal by trusted professionals, and the public scrutiny of her personal tragedy remained present. Each day offered both affirmation and challenge, moments of peace interspersed with sudden waves of grief triggered by memory, media coverage, or the ongoing administrative tasks associated with advocacy. Yet Marianne remained committed to sustaining the balance between personal mourning and public responsibility. The recovery of Ethan's body was not the end of her journey, but a turning point, a transformation from a private struggle into a public mission that honored both her son and the broader community of families affected by similar violations. In retrospect, Marianne understood the profound scope of the journey she had undertaken. From the shock of discovering that her son had never been cremated, through the painstaking investigation of Hale's network, to the legal battles and eventual reclamation of Ethan's body, the experience had tested every aspect of her resilience. She had confronted grief, betrayal, systemic corruption, and public scrutiny, emerging not only with the recovery of her son, but with a platform to advocate for ethical reform. Ethan's body, finally at rest, was a tangible reminder of both what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. Marianne's dedication, perseverance, and courage had transformed an unimaginable personal tragedy into a catalyst for justice, reform, and empowerment, ensuring that the lessons of her experience would extend far beyond her own life, touching the lives of families, institutions, and policymakers across the country. The day Leonard Hale was brought into the courtroom for sentencing was heavy with a sense of culmination, a convergence of years of grief, investigation, and painstaking legal work. Marianne Brooks sat in the front row, flanked by her attorneys and a small group of families she had connected with during the investigation. Each face in the room bore a story of loss, betrayal, and eventual advocacy. These families had been drawn together by shared tragedy, united in their desire to ensure that the exploitation of their loved ones would not remain hidden. As Hale was led in, a man who had once been untouchable in his calculated indifference, Marianne felt a mixture of anticipation, anger, and a fragile sense of relief. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, a collective acknowledgement of the years of deception, the stolen bodies, and the painstaking work that had finally brought some measure of accountability. The prosecution presented a detailed summary of Hale's actions, outlining the scope of his fraudulent operations. Marianne listened as attorneys described the forged cremation certificates, falsified consent forms, and the intricate network of intermediaries and exhibition companies through which he had trafficked human remains. The numbers were staggering: dozens of families affected, countless bodies mishandled, and years of meticulously planned deception. Yet beyond the statistics, Marianne could visualize each individual story, each human life represented by the case files and exhibits before the court. She thought of Ethan, of the months she had spent navigating grief compounded by betrayal, and of the dozens of other families who had suffered similar violations of trust. The legal narrative became more than a procedural summary. It was the culmination of personal stories converging into a collective demand for justice. Hale remained composed as the prosecution detailed the full extent of misconduct, a coldness in his demeanor that made Mariana's chest tighten. It was impossible to reconcile the detached man sitting there with the years of pain, grief, and manipulation he had orchestrated. The defense attempted to minimize his responsibility, framing the intermediaries as independent actors and emphasizing Caleb Moore's accidental role in Ethan's death. Yet the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming, meticulously documented, and reinforced by witness testimony from former employees, intermediaries, and families themselves. Marianne found herself focusing not on Hale's composure, but on the undeniable truth of the evidence, the chain of fraud, and the irrefutable impact of his actions on countless grieving families. As the judge reviewed the evidence and listened to arguments, Marianne felt a profound mix of emotions. There was the lingering grief for Ethan, the sorrow for years lost and experiences stolen, and the immense satisfaction of seeing the network of deception laid bare. Each witness statement, each cross-referenced in voice, and each corroborated account reinforced the reality that this was a deliberate, systemic exploitation of human vulnerability. Mariana's years of advocacy, the painstaking documentation she had maintained, and the emotional resilience she had cultivated were all converging in this moment. The courtroom became a space where justice, sorrow, and moral reckoning intersected. A stage on which the consequences of years of deception were being confronted publicly. When the judge pronounced Hale's sentence, Marianne felt a wave of complex relief. Hale would face years in prison, the legal system finally acknowledging the scale and severity of his actions. For Marianne, the sentence was not simply about punishment. It was validation, recognition that her grief had been real, that her loss had been manipulated, and that justice could, at least partially, restore the dignity that had been stripped away. The room seemed to exhale collectively, a shared acknowledgement from families, attorneys, and observers that accountability had been achieved. Marianne's gaze lingered on the man who had orchestrated the deception, a silent affirmation that while he had sought to exploit grief, he could not erase the resilience, advocacy, and persistence of those he had wronged. Outside the courtroom, the public exposure of the network reverberated widely. News outlets highlighted the bizarre and horrifying details: bodies sold and displayed, families deceived, and a funeral director whose manipulation spanned years and multiple states. Marianne found herself speaking with reporters, offering both factual accounts and reflections on the emotional toll of the deception. She emphasized not only the personal horror of Ethan's story, but also the systemic issues that had allowed such exploitation to persist. Her voice became a conduit for awareness, drawing attention to regulatory gaps, corporate negligence, and the ethical obligations of the funeral and exhibition industries. The public narrative shifted from sensational horror to informed advocacy, recognizing the need for accountability and reform. Marianne also focused on providing closure for other families affected by Hale's network. She coordinated support meetings, facilitated the sharing of information, and worked closely with attorneys to ensure that legal processes allowed families to reclaim remains and secure documentation validating proper handling. Each family's story added to the broader understanding of the network's scope, reinforcing the need for systemic change and creating a sense of collective empowerment. Mariana's advocacy extended beyond her personal loss, transforming grief into a catalyst for education, reform, and community support. Her efforts ensured that the lessons learned from Ethan's case would have lasting impact, informing both policy and public awareness. The emotional significance of the sentencing and public exposure was profound. For Marianne, it was a moment of symbolic closure, a tangible acknowledgement that the deception she had endured was real and that the individuals responsible were being held accountable. Yet it was also a reminder of the years lost, the mourning misdirected, and the intimate violations of trust that could never be fully undone. She allowed herself to grieve anew, this time when the context of validation and advocacy. Her sorrow was still present, but it was tempered by the knowledge that her perseverance had created real change, both in her own life and in the lives of others who had suffered similar violations. The public exposure of the network amplified this effect, ensuring that the exploitation could not remain hidden, and that Hale's actions would serve as a cautionary tale and a point of reference for reform. Mariana's next steps involved continued engagement with the legal and regulatory aspects of the case. While Hale's sentencing was a milestone, the broader network required ongoing scrutiny. Families needed assistance navigating bureaucratic hurdles, reclaiming remains, and understanding their legal rights. Marianne's meticulous records, combined with the network she had built among other affected families, became an invaluable resource. She provided guidance, emotional support, and strategic advice, ensuring that the momentum generated by Hale's sentencing could be sustained. Her work highlighted the interconnectedness of personal grief, systemic failure, and legal accountability, illustrating how one individual's perseverance could impact a larger system of justice and oversight. The community of families Marianne had helped coalesce found solace and strength in collective recognition. Through shared experiences, public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing, and the formal accountability imposed on Hale, families began to reconstruct their understanding of loss, grief, and dignity. Marianne witnessed the transformation firsthand. Parents who had felt powerless, children who had been denied closure, and siblings who had struggled in silence now had access to validation, support, and tangible outcomes. The sentencing of Hale and the exposure of his network were not endpoints but catalysts for healing, advocacy, and continued vigilance. Marianne's role as a central advocate ensured that the lessons of the case would extend far beyond the courtroom, influencing public awareness, regulatory attention, and familial empowerment. By the conclusion of the proceedings, Marianne reflected on the journey from discovery to accountability. The theft, deception, and commodification of Ethan's body had initiated a chain of events that tested every aspect of her emotional, intellectual, and ethical resilience. Yet through meticulous documentation, relentless advocacy, and collaboration with investigators, attorneys, and other families, she had transformed a personal tragedy into a movement for justice and reform. The public exposure of Hale's network, the sentencing of a man who had exploited grief for profit, and the restoration of dignity to affected families marked a turning point. Mariana's perseverance had ensured that Ethan's story, and the stories of countless others, would not be erased or forgotten, leaving a legacy of advocacy, accountability, and the enduring power of a mother's love to effect change. In the months following Leonard Hale's sentencing, Marianne found herself facing a new challenge, one that extended far beyond her personal grief and the courtroom battles she had endured. While the legal victory had provided some measure of closure and justice for Ethan, Marianne understood that the systemic issues she had uncovered were far from resolved. Families continued to be vulnerable to the same kinds of deception, and the gaps in regulation that had allowed Hale's network to operate remained. Driven by both her experience and a sense of moral duty, Marianne began laying the groundwork for what would become the Ethan Brooks Advocacy Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting families, promoting transparency, and reforming the funeral and body donation industry across multiple states. The first step was creating a support network for families who had been directly impacted by Hale's activities or who had experienced similar deceptions. Marianne reached out to the parents, siblings, and loved ones she had met during the investigation, inviting them to participate in structured support groups and information sessions. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They offered emotional support, provided guidance on navigating legal and bureaucratic systems, and helped families share resources and strategies. Marianne understood that grief could be isolating, especially when compounded by betrayal, and she worked tirelessly to create a safe, empathetic environment in which families could process their emotions collectively. The foundation began with a modest office in Cleveland, a small staff, and Marianne herself dedicating long hours to ensuring that every family had a voice and access to necessary resources. Education became a central focus of the Foundation's work. Marianne organized workshops and seminars for families, funeral directors, and legal professionals, highlighting the risks of fraudulent practices and teaching strategies for verification and accountability. She collaborated with regulatory bodies and law enforcement agencies to develop guidelines for best practices, including tracking, documentation, and consent procedures. The Foundation produced written materials and online resources, providing checklists, sample contracts, and information on red flags that might indicate malpractice or fraud. Marianne's experience gave her unparalleled credibility. She was able to speak from both personal experience and deep involvement in the legal and investigative processes, bridging the gap between the technicalities of law and the lived experience of grief and loss. Marianne also engaged with policymakers at the state and national level, advocating for legislation that would strengthen oversight of funeral homes, body donation programs, and companies involved in the sale and exhibition of human remains. She presented testimony at legislative hearings, drawing on both Ethan's story and the broader network of families affected by Hale's operations. Her arguments were grounded in meticulous documentation invoices, forged documents, and the chain of custody records she had compiled during the investigation. These concrete examples illustrated not just the human cost of negligence and fraud, but also the regulatory weaknesses that allowed such exploitation to persist. Lawmakers began to recognize the urgency of reform, and Marianne's advocacy played a pivotal role in the drafting and passage of bills aimed at improving transparency, consent verification, and legal accountability. The Foundation also addressed the emotional toll experienced by families. Marianne understood that legal victories and systemic reform, while crucial, could not alone heal the wounds inflicted by years of deception. The Foundation employed grief counselors and trained volunteers to provide emotional support, crisis intervention, and guidance on navigating the social and psychological ramifications of discovering that a loved one's remains had been mishandled. Marianne often spoke at workshops herself, sharing her own experience of shock, betrayal, and eventual empowerment. Her honesty and vulnerability created a space in which other parents and relatives could feel understood, validated, and encouraged to take action. In this way, the Foundation's work became holistic, addressing both the procedural and emotional dimensions of grief, deception, and justice. Marianne's advocacy extended into public awareness campaigns designed to educate the broader community. Through media appearances, op-eds, and social media initiatives, she highlighted the ethical and legal responsibilities of funeral homes and donation programs, drawing attention to the need for vigilance and informed consent. She emphasized that families should be empowered to ask questions, verify documentation, and demand transparency, turning her personal tragedy into a lesson for society at large. These campaigns also underscored the importance of public accountability. When institutions are aware that the community is informed and vigilant, they are more likely to adhere to ethical standards and regulations. Marianne's voice became a symbol of resilience, responsibility, and maternal advocacy, resonating with people far beyond Cleveland and Phoenix. The Foundation grew steadily, expanding its reach to multiple states and forming partnerships with legal aid organizations, grief support networks, and advocacy groups focused on consumer rights and ethical oversight. Marianne developed a strategic plan to ensure sustainability, securing grants, donations, and volunteer support to maintain operations and extend services. She prioritized transparency and accountability within the Foundation itself, modeling the values she sought to instill in the industries she was seeking to reform. Every initiative, from legislative advocacy to public education and emotional support programs, was designed to create lasting impact, ensuring that families would be better protected and that the kinds of exploitation Ethan had suffered could be prevented in the future. In addition to structural and educational efforts, Marianne focused on policy reform. She worked with legislators to draft regulations that required funeral homes and body donation programs to maintain verifiable records, implement consent verification protocols, and undergo periodic audits. These measures aim to create a culture of accountability and ethical responsibility, reducing the risk of exploitation and fraud. Marianne's first-hand experience gave her insights that were invaluable to policymakers, enabling them to understand the human consequences behind the regulatory gaps and to craft measures that were both effective and enforceable. Her efforts resulted in several states passing laws that strengthened oversight, mandated transparency, and empowered families with clear avenues for complaint and recourse. The impact of the Ethan Brooks Advocacy Foundation was profound. Families who had been isolated in their grief and confusion found guidance, support, and the tools to reclaim agency over the disposition of their loved ones' remains. Funeral homes and intermediaries faced greater scrutiny, and the industry as a whole began to adopt more rigorous documentation, tracking, and consent practices. Marianne's work demonstrated that individual advocacy, grounded in personal experience and meticulous documentation, could drive systemic change, influencing both policy and public perception. The Foundation's efforts also inspired further research and public dialogue about ethical standards in the handling of human remains, fostering a culture in which dignity, transparency, and respect were prioritized. Despite the success of these initiatives, Marianne never lost sight of the personal dimension of her advocacy. Every program, every legal reform, every public statement was rooted in her experience with Ethan, the grief she endured, the betrayal she suffered, and the relief of reclaiming his body. Her story remained a central pillar of the Foundation's narrative, illustrating the human cost of negligence and fraud while highlighting the power of resilience, persistence, and maternal advocacy. Marianne's work ensured that Ethan's legacy extended far beyond his life and death, becoming a force for ethical responsibility, systemic accountability, and compassionate support for families facing unimaginable loss. Through tireless dedication, Marianne transformed personal tragedy into a vehicle for societal change. The Foundation became a beacon of hope and advocacy, offering families the tools to protect themselves, demand transparency, and navigate the complex landscape of funeral services and body donation programs. Marianne's journey from the moment she discovered Ethan's body had been sold and displayed, through the legal battles, the recovery of his remains, and the public exposure of Hale's network, to the creation of a lasting advocacy organization that demonstrated the profound impact one determined individual could have on both policy and human lives. Her efforts ensured that Ethan's story would not only be remembered but would also serve as a catalyst for meaningful reform, protecting the dignity and humanity of countless families in the years to come. Even after the courtroom battles had concluded and the Foundation was established, Marianne Brooks realized that the journey was far from over. The sentencing of Leonard Hale had brought a measure of justice, and the public exposure of his fraudulent network had sparked awareness and reform. But the personal and emotional toll of the years of grief, betrayal, and advocacy remained profound. Marianne's days were consumed with meetings, policy discussions, and supporting families affected by similar tragedies. Yet the weight of her own loss persisted. She found herself reflecting on the years she had spent believing her son was gone forever, mourning over ashes that were never his, and grappling with the knowledge that his body had been treated as an object for so long. The emotional scars were deep, woven into every interaction she had, every decision she made, and every family she helped. In quiet moments, Marianne allowed herself to confront the enormity of her experience. She would sit alone in her home, staring at photographs of Ethan as a child, a teenager, and a young adult, reliving memories that were both joyful and painfully poignant. The small routines they had shared, morning breakfasts, trips to the lake, quiet conversations about school work, and life flashed through her mind. A reminder of the boy who had been at the center of a story, so cruelly manipulated. These moments of reflection were often accompanied by tears, sometimes sudden and unexpected, sometimes steady and cathartic. Marianne recognized that grief was not linear, and that even after years of relentless advocacy and legal triumph, the personal journey of mourning would continue alongside her public efforts. The foundation became a lifeline not just for other families, but for Marianne herself. It offered a structure and purpose that helped channel her emotions into productive action. Each initiative, whether it was a public awareness campaign, a legislative proposal, or a support group session, became a way to transform personal pain into societal benefit. Marianne poured herself into ensuring that other families would not suffer in silence, that their grief would not be exploited, and that they would have access to information, legal resources, and emotional support. Her advocacy was a constant reminder of the dual nature of her work, deeply personal and intensely public, rooted in the love she had for Ethan, and the moral imperative to prevent similar violations from occurring in the future. The challenges of sustaining the foundation were numerous. Marianne faced bureaucratic hurdles, resistance from industry stakeholders, and the persistent emotional weight of recounting traumatic events to legislators, journalists, and other families. Each day demanded a balance of advocacy, administration, and personal care, a triad that often left her exhausted but resolute. She had to negotiate with lawmakers on complex regulatory language, ensure compliance with legal frameworks for advocacy organizations, and manage the expectations of families who looked to her for guidance and support. Marianne's ability to navigate these challenges relied on her resilience, organizational skills, and the deep moral clarity that had guided her since discovering the truth about Ethan's fate. Throughout this period, Marianne also focused on the emotional recovery of the families she supported. She understood that legal resolutions, policy changes, and public exposure, while critical, could not alone heal the wounds inflicted by loss and betrayal. Grief counseling, peer support networks, and facilitated dialogue became central components of the Foundation's programs. Marianne often led sessions herself, sharing her experience with vulnerability and honesty, modeling both strength and acceptance. Families found solace in her presence, in the understanding that their emotions were valid, that their anger and sorrow were natural, and that the path toward closure, while challenging, was navigable. These interactions reinforced Marianne's own healing process, reminding her that personal grief and public advocacy could coexist, each informing and strengthening the other. The societal impact of Marianne's work began to take tangible form. Legislative reforms in multiple states introduced stricter oversight for funeral homes, clearer guidelines for body donations, and more rigorous consent and documentation requirements. Funeral industry associations implemented additional training, compliance audits, and ethical standards in response to heightened public awareness. Marianne's advocacy provided the ethical and emotional justification for these changes, showing policymakers and industry leaders the human consequences of neglect, fraud, and systemic loopholes. Each policy victory was a milestone, a testament to the power of persistent advocacy grounded in personal experience. Marianne recognized that while the reforms could not undo the past, they could protect future families from similar pain. Despite these successes, Marianne remained acutely aware of the ongoing emotional complexity of her journey. Advocacy brought renewed exposure to her own trauma. Recounting Ethan's story, reviewing case files, and interacting with grieving families could trigger waves of sorrow, flashbacks, or unexpected tears. Marianne learned to navigate these triggers with mindfulness and support, relying on counseling, close friends, and colleagues within the Foundation. She developed a rhythm that balanced active advocacy with self-care, recognizing that her effectiveness in supporting others depended on maintaining her own emotional health. The process required discipline, introspection, and acceptance that healing was neither linear nor complete, but that resilience could coexist with grief. Over time, Marianne also became a mentor and guide for other advocates and organizations addressing systemic injustices. Her experience provided insights into how personal tragedy could inform policy, how detailed documentation and methodical investigation could substantiate advocacy, and how emotional authenticity could strengthen public engagement. She spoke at conferences, contributed to research on ethical standards in the funeral and body donation industries, and collaborated with legal experts to refine best practices for family advocacy. Marianne's voice, grounded in lived experience, carried weight in professional and public arenas, bridging the gap between technical expertise and the moral urgency of protecting vulnerable families. Marianne's personal journey remained intertwined with her advocacy work, even as she saw tangible reforms enacted and families empowered. The emotional connection to Ethan and the years of lost mourning never fully dissipated. She continued to honor his memory in private rituals, integrating remembrance into her daily life and the ongoing operations of the foundation. The narrative of grief transformed into one of purpose, resilience, and action, illustrating that the process of healing could coexist with proactive engagement in systemic reform. Marianne's life became a testament to the power of channeling personal tragedy into broader societal impact, showing that love, persistence, and moral clarity could create change far beyond the individual experience of loss. Through her relentless advocacy, Marianne helped establish a legacy that extended Ethan's memory into tangible societal improvements. Policies protecting families, increased transparency and accountability in the handling of human remains, and the creation of support networks for grieving parents were all testaments to her determination. Marianne understood that these achievements, while rooted in personal pain, had the potential to transform the landscape of ethical oversight and family empowerment for generations to come. Her journey demonstrated that even in the aftermath of profound betrayal and grief, a single individual's dedication could catalyze systemic change, providing both protection and hope for countless others. As Marianne reflected on her journey, she recognized that the story of Ethan, the legal battles, the public exposure of Hale's network, and the establishment of the Advocacy Foundation were all interconnected elements of a larger narrative, one of resilience, accountability, and the enduring power of a mother's love. The work was ongoing, the emotional journey continuous, and the need for vigilance ever present. Yet Marianne faced each day with purpose, honoring her son's memory through action, advocacy, and empathy. Her story became a model for how personal loss could be transformed into societal good, illustrating that grief, when channeled with clarity and determination, could create lasting impact that extended far beyond individual experience. Marianne Brooks had never imagined that her personal tragedy would one day resonate across the nation, shaping policy and altering the way funeral homes, body donation programs, and exhibition companies operated. The story of her son, Ethan, had initially been a private anguish, a grief that consumed her in the quiet moments at home and haunted her during sleepless nights. Yet through painstaking investigation, legal battles, and the tireless efforts of the Ethan Brooks Advocacy Foundation, her experience became a catalyst for reform on a scale she had never anticipated. Lawmakers, regulators, and industry leaders began to recognize the profound gaps in oversight and ethical responsibility, and Marianne was at the forefront, transforming her personal loss into a nationwide movement for accountability. The first major legislative victories came in her home state of Ohio, where Marianne had worked closely with sympathetic legislators to draft comprehensive laws governing funeral practices and body donation programs. These measures required that funeral homes maintain verifiable records of cremations, track donations of human remains meticulously, and obtain explicit consent from families or donors before any transfer or use. Each provision was informed by Marianne's experience with Ethan, translating the minutiae of her ordeal into clear, actionable regulations. She advocated tirelessly in committee hearings, providing a human dimension to what might have otherwise been abstract policy proposals. When she described the discovery of Ethan's plastinated body in an exhibition, lawmakers listened with a mix of shock and urgency, understanding that their constituents could be vulnerable to similar exploitation without rigorous oversight. Mariana's influence quickly spread beyond Ohio. The public attention generated by the media coverage of her case and the legal proceedings against Leonard Hale brought national scrutiny to the funeral and body donation industries. Policymakers in multiple states began to examine their own regulations, recognizing that what had occurred in Ohio and Arizona could happen elsewhere. Mariana traveled to testify at hearings, presenting her meticulously documented case, offering both empirical evidence and emotional testimony. She emphasized the human cost of neglect and fraud, the psychological impact on families, and the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed Hale's operations to flourish for years. Her advocacy created a sense of moral urgency, bridging the gap between abstract legislative discussion and the lived reality of grief and exploitation. One of the most significant challenges Mariana faced was convincing policymakers and industry stakeholders to embrace stricter regulation. Some argued that the industry was self-regulating, that ethical standards were already in place, or that additional oversight would impose unnecessary burdens. Mariana countered these arguments by pointing to the concrete failures revealed in her investigation: forged cremation certificates, falsified consent forms, the sale and exhibition of bodies without authorization, and the long-term emotional harm inflicted on families. She demonstrated how gaps in oversight and inconsistent enforcement allowed unethical actors to exploit both the vulnerable and the grieving. Her detailed evidence, combined with the compelling narrative of her personal loss, shifted perceptions. Lawmakers began to see that regulation was not an imposition but a safeguard, protecting families from harm while preserving the integrity of the industry. As legislation began to take shape, Mariana also worked to ensure that the reforms would be practical and enforceable. She collaborated with regulatory agencies to develop standards for tracking and documenting human remains, creating systems that could be audited and verified without imposing unnecessary burdens on funeral homes or donation programs. She helped design reporting requirements, compliance protocols, and procedures for verifying consent, balancing legal rigor with operational feasibility. Mariana's approach was methodical and empathetic. She understood that reforms needed to protect families, respect ethical obligations, and be sustainable over time. Her work demonstrated that systemic change was possible when driven by both personal experience and strategic collaboration with experts in law, policy, and industry practice. The ripple effect of Mariana's advocacy became apparent as states began passing legislation inspired by her model. Ohio's laws were followed by similar statutes in Arizona, California, and New York, each tailored to local needs but incorporating core principles of consent, transparency, and accountability. Funeral homes across the country adopted more stringent record-keeping practices, implemented internal audits, and provided clearer communication with families regarding cremation and donation procedures. Body donation programs instituted verification systems and reinforced training for staff handling remains. Even exhibition companies became more cautious, ensuring documentation and consent were transparent and verifiable. Mariana's work created a chain reaction, prompting reforms that extended far beyond her initial case and reshaping industry standards nationwide. Public awareness campaigns were another cornerstone of the reforms. Mariana understood that legal change alone could not protect families if the public remained uninformed. She spearheaded initiatives to educate families about their rights, the importance of documentation, and the potential pitfalls in the handling of human remains. Through workshops, online resources, and media engagement, she reached thousands of people, equipping them with tools to verify funeral arrangements, donation agreements, and cremation procedures. Mariana emphasized that vigilance was not about mistrust, but about empowerment, ensuring that families could make informed decisions and protect the dignity of their loved ones. These efforts transformed public consciousness, creating a cultural shift in how death, mourning, and ethical responsibility were understood. The national reforms also encouraged academic and professional engagement with the ethics of body handling and funeral practices. Universities, professional associations, and ethics committees began hosting discussions and developing curricula based on Mariana's advocacy, integrating her case into studies on legal compliance, bioethics, and human dignity. Scholars analyzed the systemic failures revealed in Hale's network, using the case as a teaching tool to highlight vulnerabilities in regulation and oversight. Mariana's story, once a private tragedy, became a touchstone for ethical inquiry, demonstrating the interplay between personal loss, systemic exploitation, and the possibility of reform. Her advocacy bridged the gap between lived experience and professional practice, influencing both public policy and professional standards. Despite these achievements, Mariana remained deeply aware of the ongoing work required. Legislative reforms, while significant, could not immediately erase the harm done to families who had already been affected. Mariana continued to provide guidance, support, and advocacy for those seeking to reclaim remains, understand documentation, or navigate the emotional aftermath of discovery. She expanded the Foundation's services, training volunteers, hiring counselors, and creating networks for ongoing peer support. Mariana recognized that systemic change was a long-term endeavor, one that required continuous vigilance, community engagement, and a commitment to both legal and emotional accountability. Through her efforts, Mariana witnessed a transformation not only in policy but in public attitudes toward grief, ethics, and the responsibility of institutions handling human remains. Families became more informed, industry stakeholders more accountable, and regulators more proactive. Mariana's work demonstrated the power of personal advocacy to catalyze systemic reform, showing that individual experience, when combined with determination, documentation, and strategic action, could affect widespread societal change. Ethan's story, once a source of profound personal tragedy, became the foundation for enduring improvements in ethical standards, legal oversight, and public awareness, ensuring that no family would face the same deception and exploitation in the future. Years had passed since Mariana Brooks first discovered that her son, Ethan, had never been cremated, and yet the memories of that day remained vivid, etched into her consciousness with the sharpness of a wound that had never fully healed. She often thought back to the moment she stood before his plastinated body in Phoenix. The surreal and horrifying confirmation that everything she had believed about his death had been a lie. The grief that had once consumed her seemed, over time, to transform into a quiet, determined resolve. It was a grief tempered by action, shaped by the work she had done to reclaim her son, expose the fraudulent network, and ensure that no other family would endure the same betrayal. Yet even in the triumphs, there was a lingering ache, a recognition that the years lost could never be restored, and that certain intimacies and milestones in Ethan's life were forever denied. Mariana's daily life was now a balance between personal remembrance and public advocacy. Each morning she would light a candle in her home, a ritual she had developed to honor Ethan's memory, and she often spoke aloud to him, recounting her day, sharing the small joys and frustrations of life, as though he were listening. This private communion provided both solace and grounding, a reminder that despite the theft of years, and the manipulation of his remains, her connection to him remained unbroken. She carried his presence with her into her work, allowing the love and memory of her son to guide her decisions, interactions, and advocacy. Every family she supported, every policy change she pursued, and every public speech she delivered bore the imprint of that enduring connection. The Ethan Brooks Advocacy Foundation had grown into a national institution, respected for its meticulous approach to protecting families, advocating for systemic reform, and promoting transparency in funeral and donation practices. Mariana's vision had expanded from addressing the immediate harms done by Leonard Hale to a broader mission, ensuring that ethical standards, legal accountability, and emotional support became foundational elements of the funeral industry nationwide. She worked with legislators to implement standardized procedures, trained funeral directors in ethical handling practices, and partnered with law schools to create curricula emphasizing the moral and legal responsibilities of professionals handling human remains. Marianne understood that systemic change required both education and enforcement, and she dedicated herself to bridging the gap between policy, practice, and lived human experience. Despite the extensive legal and regulatory achievements, Marianne remained deeply attuned to the emotional dimension of her work. She knew that systemic reforms alone could not heal the trauma inflicted on families, nor could they fully restore trust. To address this, she organized retreats, counseling programs, and peer support networks that allowed families to share their experiences, grieve collectively, and find empowerment in community. Marianne often participated in these sessions herself, sharing the story of her journey from discovery to advocacy, modeling both vulnerability and resilience. Families found solace in her presence, comfort in her honesty, and courage in her example. Through these interactions, Marianne realized that her legacy was not only measured in laws passed or systems reformed, but also in the lives she had touched and the grief she had helped transform into resilience and action. Marianne also took time to reflect on the broader societal impact of her work. The public exposure of Leonard Hale's network had sparked national conversation about ethical standards, consent, and transparency in the handling of human remains. Funeral homes and body donation programs across the country revised their policies, implemented stricter documentation and tracking procedures, and provided clearer communication with families. Marianne's advocacy had highlighted not only individual wrongdoing but systemic vulnerabilities, showing that regulations without enforcement and transparency left families exposed to exploitation. She understood that cultural change shifting public expectations about accountability, dignity, and ethics was as important as legal reform, and she dedicated herself to promoting awareness through speaking engagements, media appearances, and educational campaigns. Her personal journey and advocacy work were intertwined in ways that were both emotionally complex and deeply fulfilling. Marianne carried the weight of years of grief, yet she found meaning in the transformation of that grief into purpose. Each family supported by the foundation represented a small victory against the exploitation her son had endured, a reaffirmation that her pain could catalyze positive change. Every policy implemented, every awareness campaign launched, and every industry reform achieved served as a living memorial to Ethan, a testament to the enduring power of maternal love and resilience. Marianne had learned that grief could be both deeply personal and profoundly generative, capable of inspiring societal change when guided by purpose and clarity. Even as she celebrated these achievements, Marianne remained vigilant. She knew that systemic vulnerabilities could never be entirely eradicated, and that complacency might allow future exploitation. The foundation continued to monitor industry practices, provide guidance to families navigating funeral arrangements, and advocate for continual improvement in transparency and accountability. Marianne's work had become a lifelong commitment, one that required constant attention, adaptation, and dedication. She accepted that advocacy was an ongoing process, that the pursuit of justice and ethical responsibility was never truly complete, and that her role was to ensure that vigilance remained an integral part of industry practice and public consciousness. Marianne also reflected on the personal growth and transformation she had undergone. The journey from despair to empowerment had been arduous, requiring emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate legal, bureaucratic, and public challenges simultaneously. She had learned to balance grief with action, sorrow with advocacy, and personal loss with public responsibility. The process had revealed depths of courage and determination she had not known existed, and while the pain of losing Ethan could never be erased, it had been channeled into creating enduring structures of protection, support, and reform. Marianne's story became an example of how profound personal tragedy, when coupled with relentless determination, could generate transformative societal impact. In her quieter moments, Marianne often contemplated the enduring legacy of her efforts. Ethan's life, his death, and the years of deception had left an indelible mark on her. Yet she had managed to convert that mark into something constructive, meaningful, and lasting. The Foundation's work ensured that his story would continue to protect families, influence policy, and promote ethical standards long after her own involvement. Marianne recognized that the truest measure of her journey was not simply the reforms achieved, but the lives touched, the grief alleviated, and the awareness raised across the nation. Through these ongoing efforts, Ethan's memory became inseparable from a broader mission of justice, dignity, and human respect. Ultimately, Marianne's journey demonstrated the enduring power of love, resilience, and advocacy. From the initial shock of discovering her son had been stolen and exploited, through years of legal, emotional, and systemic work, she had transformed private grief into public impact. The foundation she established, the policies influenced, and the families empowered represented the culmination of a life devoted to ensuring that no other mother, father, or loved one would endure the same deception. Marianne understood that while the wounds of loss could never fully heal, they could be transformed into a force for change. A legacy that honored the memory of a child lost too soon and ensured dignity, protection, and justice for those who came after. The story of Marianne Brooks and her son Ethan teaches us that grief, deception, and injustice are never just private matters. They can ripple across communities and reveal systemic vulnerabilities that demand attention. One of the most powerful lessons is the importance of vigilance and awareness when we trust institutions with our most vulnerable moments. Families naturally assume that funeral homes, medical facilities, and donation programs operate with integrity, that legal documents are truthful, and that professionals are guided by ethical standards. Marianne's experience reveals that blind trust, even when born of grief or necessity, can leave individuals exposed to exploitation. It underscores the critical need for education, transparency, and accountability in all systems that intersect with human life, death, and memory. The world assumes that when we hand over our loved one as care, our grief is respected, but the story demonstrates that ethical complacency can have devastating consequences. Another lesson lies in the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable betrayal. Marianne's journey illustrates how grief can be transformed into purpose, how despair can catalyze action, and how love can become a guiding force for systemic change. Her relentless pursuit of truth, despite repeated emotional and bureaucratic obstacles, highlights the power of persistence, courage, and moral clarity. In a world where personal tragedy can be exploited, Marianne's story reminds us that individuals are capable of turning pain into advocacy, transforming private loss into public impact. It is a testament to how one person's commitment can illuminate widespread injustices, expose systemic failures, and protect countless others from harm. The story reinforces the idea that personal agency, when combined with careful documentation, strategic thinking, and collaboration, can overcome even the most entrenched and opaque networks of wrongdoing. The narrative also emphasizes the profound responsibility we carry toward the vulnerable, particularly those who cannot speak for themselves. Ethan's body, manipulated and displayed without consent, symbolizes the broader ethical imperative to honor human dignity in life and death. The story urges us to question not only overt acts of harm but also the structures that allow such acts to occur unchecked. It reveals that exploitation is often enabled by gaps in regulation, institutional complacency, or the assumption that no one would notice. Marianne's advocacy demonstrates that confronting these structures requires both vigilance and courage, and that ethical responsibility is a shared societal duty. By exposing these vulnerabilities and demanding reform, she not only secured justice for her son, but also reinforced the principle that dignity, consent, and accountability must remain non-negotiable, even in highly bureaucratic or emotionally charged domains. Moreover, the story teaches us about the power of community and collective action. Marianne's efforts to connect with other families, build networks of support, and provide both legal and emotional guidance, illustrate how shared experience can strengthen advocacy and create lasting impact. Personal grief becomes a communal resource when paired with collaboration, and collective voice becomes a tool for systemic change. Through her leadership, Marianne demonstrated that advocacy is not only about individual effort, but also about empowering others to reclaim agency, amplify their experiences, and demand accountability. Her work shows that even in the most isolating experiences of loss and betrayal, shared resilience and mutual support can transform trauma into reform, turning private grief into a public force for good. Finally, the story challenges us to reconsider the meaning of justice and closure. Marianne's path was not linear. Legal victories, policy reform, and public awareness were all part of a complex process that intertwined emotion, ethics, and law. Closure is not a single moment, but a continuum that encompasses recognition of wrongdoing, systemic reform, personal healing, and the safeguarding of others from similar harm. The narrative teaches that achieving justice often requires persistence, patience, and multifaceted strategies, blending legal action with advocacy, emotional support, and public education. Marianne's story reminds us that while some harms cannot be undone, their consequences can be mitigated, and dignity can be restored through deliberate, principled action. It challenges society to honor both the victims of injustice and those who fight tirelessly to prevent future violations. In essence, the story of Marianne and Ethan is a profound meditation on trust, resilience, and moral responsibility. It reminds us that grief, while intensely personal, is inseparable from the social and ethical contexts in which it exists. It teaches that advocacy born from love and pain can catalyze societal change, that vigilance and accountability are essential in all institutions entrusted with human lives, and that dignity and consent are non-negotiable principles. It emphasizes the power of community, the importance of systemic reform, and the enduring impact of one person's commitment to truth and justice. Most importantly, it conveys that even in the face of unimaginable loss and betrayal, hope, resilience, and purposeful action can transform tragedy into a force for lasting good. Marianne's journey is a testament to the human capacity for endurance, moral courage, and the ability to create meaningful change from the depths of personal grief. Through this story, we learn that loss can become a teacher, grief can become a guide, and injustice can become a call to action. It encourages society to reflect on the structures we trust, the ethical responsibilities we hold, and the ways we can empower those who are vulnerable. It urges individuals to act with integrity, advocate for transparency, and support one another in moments of profound vulnerability. Marianne's experience is both a cautionary tale and an inspiring example, illustrating that while tragedy may shape us, our responses to it define the legacy we leave not only for ourselves but for the communities, industries, and systems we touch. The lessons extend beyond Ethan's story, providing guidance on vigilance, ethical responsibility, and the transformative power of advocacy in the pursuit of justice, dignity, and societal reform. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid and we'll continue exploring them together.